Hey everybody, it's me, Angela Walters. Welcome to this week's live chat. Every week on Thursday at 3 p.m. Central, I get on here, answer your questions live, talk about quilting, usually make some kind of joke that may or may not be funny, but I'm assuming that you all are laughing appropriately. So thank you so much for joining me. And if you're joining live, we are doing a giveaway for this live chat. So if you're watching live, leave a little comment. Jessica is here as always to monitor that, to write down your questions, and then to kick out the spammers. And this week's giveaway, I have some quilt clips. Now, they might not seem too crazy, but if you're working with bigger quilts on your sewing machine, it's a great way to keep them all together, or you have a last minute accessory should you need it. So all you have to do is just leave a comment on there, say hey, say go Chiefs, whatever you want to say, and then Jessica will pick a lucky winner. And if you say go Chiefs, you may have a better chance at winning. I'm only kidding. I'm excited today because we wrapped up the big part of the most recent Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along. I have one more little video to do about the borders, but I have to tell you all, I love doing these challenges. I love doing the live chats and getting to interact and answer your questions and get to know you all. I love starting it and I love finishing it. It's always such a big kind of like, it's done. So very fun. We have worked through 5 videos on the dot-to-dot quilting technique. And if you haven't watched those, you can always watch this one or any of my previous Free Motion Challenge Quilting Alongs on my YouTube channel or my website, quiltingismytherapy.com. And so in this week's live chat, I'm just going to recap what the tutorial was about on Tuesday. I have some questions to answer. And then, of course, if you're watching live, you can leave your questions and then Jessica will give them to me and I'll answer them at the end. Before we get into all that, though, last week's live chat, I had a special kind of giveaway for anybody that commented on that video, and Joe Jenkins is the winner. So I already messaged Joe and said, hey, email me your address. You get to win a little quilted sample. And that was, I was asking questions or getting your advice on the videos. So I do want to make sure that the videos are exactly what you need and hopefully can be helpful for you. So thank you for everybody that commented and gave me your input for sure. So this week we wrapped up the panel. So we did the center star and we finished the background area, and I have some pictures and stuff to show. But I also threw in a little nugget of a few tips on how to handle those bigger quilts on your sewing machine. Now, I know that some of you quilt on a long arm. That's awesome. How you approach a quilt is going to be totally different. On a sewing machine, though, when you get to the center of the quilt, for me, that is the hardest part. It is, you know, it's the heaviest everywhere. It's fallen everywhere. It's never fun to film. It never looks as good as I think it should look. And so I shared just a few tips. So if you haven't watched that, be sure to do that. A couple things that I said, make sure that you are high enough at your machine. Very common thing. Sometimes we're too low. I call it the T-Rex when your arms are up higher. Also, you want all that quilt up. You don't want it hanging or pulling. And in the type chat, before I go live on the video, there's like a little typing going on and we chat there. Somebody said, thanks for showing me how you do the smush and push is what I like to call it. Move the quilt around. There's nothing glamorous about it. There's nothing easy. It's just like a, not fun thing. So just work through that space and know that once you're done, you'll be moving on into the next area. It's for that reason that I like to start if I'm doing just like a quilt, I'll start in the center of the quilt because it will never be more difficult than right there. And I want to just get the hardest part out of the way. So the quilt clips were a little tip in there to help keep the quilt up so it's not hanging off the edge. And again, if you have to throw it over your shoulder, you have to put it wherever. And then I didn't put this in the video, but it's worth repeating. You have the most control when your hands are on either side of your needle. My worst habit, in fact, if you ever take a class from me live on a sewing machine, this is such a bad habit I have. I'll start quilting and pretty soon my hands are up here and my needle's right there. I'm using my elbows at that point. So stop and reposition your hands often. That's where you're going to have that control, especially in the center where it's the heaviest that it's going to be. So hopefully those tips were a little helpful. It's just kind of, it's like binding a quilt. It's just the thing you have to do to get the quilt done. So unfortunately, there's no, magic bullet, but usually once you get comfortable with it, it gets a little bit smoother. This week, we did not have an expanded resource PDF for the video. So in all the videos I put out, well, not all, most of the videos I put out, I like to put together a downloadable PDF tip sheet. I do that just because I know for me, it's hard to remember what I saw when I'm at the machine. So you can always download that with the links in there. All I ask is that you give the video a thumbs up or tell other quilters about them. But sometimes I have an expanded resource PDF, which is even more pictures and even more tips. I didn't have one this week for a couple reasons. We were just kind of talking about echoing. I felt like not a whole lot of content there. And then the weekend kind of got away from me, if I'm being honest. There was a big football game, very stressful, and so I just didn't get around to it. So there will not be one for this week, but I have some step-by-step pictures I'll show you, and hopefully that will help you out with that dot-to-dot echoing. I can't tell you how much I appreciate everybody that downloads the free ones, that purchases the expanded resource. Thank you so much. That really, really helps. All right, so let's get to the stuff we're going to talk about, the pictures or, some little bit more detail than I can necessarily fit in the video. And even though we're finishing up the panel, you don't have to have that custom panel to quilt along with me. So I try to pull out tips or tidbits that can apply to anything. And when we started on the center star, I kind of talked about how you can pick designs depending on where you want to draw attention to. So when we're looking at the center panel, it's kind of made into chevrons that make up the star. But when we're working with a star or a particular block like this, I've said this a lot during all the videos, but where those lines go is where your eye will go. Right, so I showed two different options, one that draws your eye to the outer points and one that draws your eye to the center point. And in the video, I kind of said it, I didn't really elaborate, but when you're trying to decide how to quilt it, because that's the question, right? When you're trying to decide how you want to go about quilting this block, it's good to know, well, what do I love about this block? If my center, if that seam in the center is very bulky because it's an 8-point star or I did not do a good job piecing it, I don't want all my lines coming to that because it's going to be difficult to quilt. I can maybe do it somewhere else. Or if the outer points of my star maybe are cut off because I am not the most precise piecer, maybe using the lines to draw your eye to the center. So it's just kind of picking and choosing based on the situation. But sometimes you're like, I don't know what to quilt. And in fact, that was a question. It was like, I got all ready to go. That's what Dawn and Tina Stewart said. I got all ready to do it, and then it was hard to know what to put where. The short answer is just get started. Just pick a space, pick a design, and when you're done, you'll learn whether you like it or not. I like to joke, it's the starting that stops most people. So when you're looking at your quilts, you don't have to overthink it. Just think, I'm going to try this, and let's see how it works. Now, I know that's easy for me to say. I'm not a perfectionist. I'm a people pleaser. It's a totally different neuroses, but really try not to overthink it because it can be a lot of fun. So I did in the free quilting diagrams have just some quick basic diagrams to give you ideas, but all the designs that we have learned throughout the last 4 videos can be used in this area. And this is a perfect opportunity to maybe find your favorite design or come up with your own variation. You don't have to quilt it just how I did. If you want to, you absolutely can, but don't feel like, oh, I have to do this. I definitely don't want to put that burden on you. And then here we can see the quilted example. I love in the video using a contrasting thread so you can really see what I'm doing. But when I'm showing the quilted samples, I like it when the thread matches a little bit more so you can see that nice overall texture. And texture is kind of like a quilty buzzword. I'm just talking about seeing the shadow of the quilting, not necessarily the thread. You can see that there's depth there, that there's, quilting there. And so it's really hard to see that when you're looking at a contrasting thread color. So this kind of gives you that, the example that you will get with that. So just know, when you're practicing a design, using a thread color that blends in with the quilt top will really just give you the nice texture, and it covers a multitude of quilting mistakes. So the first design I showed, was this kind of dot-to-dot diamond design. Same thing that we learned earlier in the series, and then I just threw some feathers in on the side. And so in the video, I kind of talked about how I quilted it by creating that shape, echoing inside, and adding the feathers. Again, be sure to check out that tutorial because this probably doesn't make any sense if you haven't seen it. But in the unquilted area between the dot-to-dot design and the edge of the block, I quilted a feather design. I love quilting feathers. I also love switching it up. I am easily bored. So the idea of doing dot-to-dot over the whole quilt, if it's not for a specific class, it's not something I probably will do. I'll alternate between the two, dot-to-dot, geometric, and some curvy filler designs. But again, you can go about this any way you want. So you can leave that out. You can use a different filler. It just really depends on what you want to do. And then in the video, I hope this wasn't confusing, I showed how you can go about it slightly differently on the long arm. So on the sewing machine, I did the geometric lines first and then the feathers, but then I went to the long arm and kind of broke it up in between the two. The example I gave, and it's a true example, I don't know if it made perfect sense. If I'm working on my long arm, I have an 18-inch throat, which means I can get about 15 to 16 inches of quilting space in there. If this portion or if this design happens to be on the side, maybe it's bigger than my throat space, being able to quilt one side and then move on to the next prevents me from having to advance back and forth. That's it. The result is exactly the same. So however you go about it, it's going to be fine. But I do like to not advance the quilt whenever I can get away with it. So if you're like, I don't know what you meant by that, Angela, just ignore it. Just ignore it. But just know that you can go about the designs in a lot of different ways to fit your situation. And then the second one, we saw the Starburst design, again, which we learned how to do way back in the first video. I say way back, it's only been like 4 weeks, but a lot happens within a free motion challenge from the first to the end video. And this one, all the lines are coming down to the center. So I'm using that center point as my home base and quilting the wedges so they extend from there and filling in that irregular area. I didn't go into a lot of detail about the specifics of quilting that because we've already seen it in a prior video, but I don't worry too much about the wedges being the same size. I just want to fill in that area as much as possible. And if you wanted to make my videos a drinking game, if you took a shot every time you heard that, fill it in as much as possible. Don't worry about your mistakes. Well, you wouldn't get much quilting done. So, but it's really so true because when it's quilted, you don't see the quilted lines as much. You see that unquilted area on the inside. So just fill in that area and move on. Now, I do try to keep it symmetrical. If I do 2 on one side, I'll do 2 wedges on the other, but there's no hard, fast rule that says you have to do it. Again, this is an example that I used if you want to draw attention to the center. For instance, maybe your outer points aren't, perfect. Or maybe you just feel like quilting that design. Sometimes that's about as deep as my thought process goes. I'm like, ooh, I want to quilt this, and so I will. I showed on the long arm a little bit of it, but you can see the 2 different examples in that pink and orange area. I think my head's probably covering part of it, but that center wedge is a slightly different shape. I'm just, quilting that center and then adding those 2 wedges on the side, depending on how big of a quilt you're working on. Not this panel, but if you're doing this in another star block, then you can add more or less wedges to really fill in that area. Then we moved to the outer center star. I was trying to think of a great way to name that, and that's about as far as it got. But when we looked at the rest of the unquilted area, I said, oh, let's do the Starburst design in some of them and the diamond design in others. Again, here, just picking that home base, quilting those wedges so they come to that point. I love to alternate between designs. Again, I get pretty bored doing the same thing over and over again, so that's why I did that. And then in the background or some of those diamonds, I just did a filler, like a swirly kind of design. But you could do another dot-to-dot design, of course, whatever you felt like doing. I didn't put this in the video, but if you want an extra little challenge, you can try a slightly contrasting thread in that area. So when I quilted the first sample, I thought, okay, I'm going to use light purple thread in around the purple one and use blue around the next one. And so it's kind of a fun way to use the thread color to draw attention. In this picture, you can kind of see those gray ones. Just a subtle hint. You don't have to do that though. If you bought the coordinating thread collection, go ahead and use the yellow or the light yellow in the background areas. So any of those gray areas. In fact, that was a question that Emro asked, what thread color to use in the background, whichever one you want. But I specifically picked out that yellow to use in that background. And what's really fun is that yellow thread we used in the yellow portions of the blocks and then in the background. So even though it's not gray, it still works because it's a neutral color in the same value. So there we can see a little bit of the purple quilting right there. Now, if you're going to use a contrasting thread, you know that the quilting is going to show up. So just be aware of that and make sure you do your best design. Or if you're wanting to show off a little bit because you're doing a video series and you want people to think it's cool, that's a great option too. But of course, definitely not required. And here I did that blue in the background. When using contrasting threads, going darker, using a thread color that's darker than the background is always a little scary. I prefer using a thread color that's lighter, but you can't get much lighter than light gray, so I had to go a little bit darker with that. Then we moved from the center to the background, and depending on if you got the smaller panel or the larger panel, you'll have more or less background to deal with. In here, I talked about dot-to-dot echoing. So using dots beyond the points to draw those lines out. And I gave some examples, and I really hope that it made sense. This is something I wish that I had tons of examples of, because it just really does help. And I'm going to show you some quilted examples. But just know that you can put those dots outside of your blocks to really pull the lines out to separate it from the filler. Now, this panel, it's rainbow, it's bright. There's not much quilting that I can do that's going to detract from it. That's the truth of the matter. But echoing is just a nice way to separate it from the filler. You don't have to do that. You could just go right into a different design, a swirl design. But I showed you two different options for doing that dot-to-dot echoing, and then hopefully I'm going to explain why you might want to do that. So I think that was something I didn't quite get in there. And here's just a different example of the quilted panel. So when you're doing a traditional echo is quilting the same shape or same line a set distance away from it. So, if I want a 1/2 inch echoing, I'll have a 1/2 inch spacing between the lines, which is great. But if I want to use dot-to-dot echoing where I'm connecting different points, it actually can change the shape of the space between the blocks. Now in this example, it's not super important, but what if you have a block with a lot of tiny jagged points and small area in between? You can use that to kind of smooth it out and make it a little bit easier to quilt. So I don't have a ton of examples, but just know that you can do this in a lot of different ways. So when I'm looking at my, I'll say block or my panel or whatever I'm going to echo around, I need to decide which points I'm going to touch and which points I'm not. In this example, we can see that the higher points are touching, the lines are going to that, and then the lower points I'm stopping a set distance away. And now that distance is just an arbitrary number you can make up. I'll say an inch, but depending on how dense you want the quilting, you can make it closer or further apart. So going from one point, stopping about an inch above the next one, and going on to the next one. So you can tell it's not that same shape because I don't have the same spacing between that whole line. One reason I love this is I'm touching the points of that block. So if I need to, at any of those points that I'm touching, I can stop, quilt the block, and move on. So having that ability to touch the block allows me to efficiently quilt it and move on. Unlike a traditional echo, which never actually touches, it just follows. Now, if you're newer at quilting and you're like, I don't understand, just know that you can use dot-to-dot echoing. You don't have to, have the whole efficiency thing down. But I love how it allows me to get into those points. Now, when you're doing dot-to-dot echoing, just like any traditional echoing, you can add multiple lines. But the more lines you add, the more it's going to change that shape. So in this graphic that I just kind of made up, we can see there's that first line. If I wanted to, I could go back and add even more. So here's a second line, come back and added another one to it. Why? I don't know, for fun, for smiles and giggles, S's and G's. But here we can see it takes that space in between the points, and now it's a little bit more evened out. It's not as sharp. And so if I'm doing something like a wishbone, which I have an example I'll show you in a second, instead of having to quilt it all the way down to that point, just making it a little bit easier to quilt. Or maybe I'm just trying to add that echoing so I don't have to do as much filler work. Again, it's totally up to you. You can do one, you can do less, however many you want. You can do one or more. You can't do less than one. Here's a quick example I found. It's a close-up of a block I quilted a while ago. The idea of touching the higher points and not touching the lower points is great if your points have a boundary. This particular block, I could do a traditional echo around the outside, but it would run into the other gray fabric, and maybe that's not the effect I'm going for here. But doing that kind of touching, not touching with that point will allow me to quilt those points, add that echo, and then if I wanted to, come back and add some more filler. So any kind of star blocks, anything English paper piece quilts, for sure, anything that's in a rotation like that, it's a great option. So if it has a defined edge. You also don't have to do dot-to-dot echoing around the whole block. So this is from the Help How Do I Quilt It Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along. And on the star points, you can see those purple star points. I did a little bit of dot-to-dot echoing just right there, just to smooth out that shape because I was quilting those wishbones in the rest of the area. Again, you don't have to do that, but it's just a little way to make it just a little bit easier for me to quilt. So you don't have to do all the points. You can pick and choose. You can also combine it with traditional echoing. So in this example, we can see what traditional echoing looks like, set distance away. So I can echo around it, and then I can do dot-to-dot echoing with that. It's like a sampler platter. It's like, I can't decide, so I'll do them all. Again, it just depends on how much space you have. And so here we can see what that would look like. All right, but what if you want to switch the dots that touch? Remember I said the points that you touch will change the shape. In this example, the lines are touching the lower points and then extending past the higher ones. And so I'm getting a much longer line. So just know that you're going to have some longer lines to quilt. Not a problem, but just being aware of that. It's really going to extend those points and help separate it from the filler. So if I have a smaller block with a lot of points, I really want to make sure it stands out. This might be something that I do. But slightly different look just by changing the dots that you pick. So it's kind of important to know that so that you can be happy with the result when you're finished with it. And if you really want me to blow your mind, you can combine both. You can do that first dot to dot echoing and then do the second dot to dot echoing. And this is what we have here. So that red line is extending it. And then I came back and added another row where I'm touching the higher points. I'll be honest with you, when I'm quilting a quilt, I'm not always sure what it's going to look like. I'm like, I'll just connect these points and let's see how it goes. And then, move on. So you don't have to have it planned out as much. You can mark out all those lines, but the problem is when you start marking out all the lines, it's really hard to know where to go. That's why I have those graphics with step by step so you can kind of see it a little bit better. When you alternate, like you do one row one way or one echo line one way and then switch, it ends up giving you kind of a traditional echoing spacing with a little bit of touching in between. So let's see some examples of that on quilts. Here's a close-up of the panel that we did in the challenge. We can see touching some points, not touching, but I have 4 echo lines here. So I went a little crazy with the echoing, but it's one of my favorite things to do. So what are you going to do? This is a really close-up example of a quilt I had. It was like a border that had triangles on it, and where I did both types of dot to dot echoing, where I touched the inner corners and not the outer one, and then vice versa, and then used filler in the rest. So it looks, I think, interesting. It allows me to quilt those blocks, add that filler, and it doesn't take that much longer. So nothing wrong with doing a traditional echo. Sometimes I do that as well, but it's just fun to change it up. And I wish sometimes I had taken better pictures. I'm not super happy with past Angela right now. She should have taken better pictures when she had the quilts. So it's kind of hard to see in here, but I really wanted to include it. This is a quilt I did for Tula Pink, and lots of jagged points. So this is a perfect example of why using dot to dot echoing helps smooth that shape out a bit, makes it easier to fill in around it. So not necessarily, I'm not talking about like flying geese necessarily, I'm just talking about like stuff like that, very pointy. And this is a in-progress picture I found back in my Google Photos. I think this is a quilt by Julie Herman, but you can see that dot to dot echoing outside the block. Just helped to separate it from the filler, gives it that nice little look. But since those lines are touching the points at certain points, I'm able to get into the block, quilt it, and move on. Not that I can't just stop, tie off thread, and start a new line of quilting, but we know I don't like to do that. So anyway, we covered a lot throughout the 5 videos, and no matter where you are in your quilting journey or where you are even within this video series, people are always like, oh my gosh, I'm so behind. You're not behind, you're on time. The videos will be there whenever you're ready. But just know that when you're working through it, you don't have to do everything I've shown. I'm just trying to give you practical ways to use them so that you will love the designs as much as I do. But don't let it be overwhelming. Even if you're like, I'm never going to quilt a star quilt, that's fine. Just know that you can use the lines to highlight and show off different portions of your blocks. Okay, so a couple of questions that came up, and then I'll answer the one Jessica's writing down. So this is a question. When changing thread color on top, but not the bottom, somebody said they're getting thread nests on the back. And so that was during the type chat. And I asked a question, there's so much going on there, I couldn't see it. So I don't know the exact situation, but one thing that makes me think of this, if you're quilting on a long arm and you're changing your top thread or you're oiling your machine, sometimes if you're a heavy oiler, it will make the first couple stitches really loose just because it's working through that mechanism. So check, be on the lookout for that. And then also if it's just the first part, maybe there's like some slack in, like you change the thread, but there's some slack in here and it's just kind of working through that. So it's weird that it would be doing it with the top thread, but not changing the bobbin thread, but usually that's going to help kind of point in a direction and kind of give you something to look at there. So hopefully that helps. The biggest problem with thread issues and tension is there's not one set rule to follow. It could be a million different things, but kind of playing detective and working through that. In fact, next week, I should say this, next week I will not have a live chat. I'm going to be in the Villages, Florida teaching. I'm so excited. I love my home, but it's winter in Missouri in February in Florida. Yes. So I won't be here, but I will be back the next week. And I think I'm going to do a tension, thread, needles, and tension, a live chat, just answering your questions live. I know I've done it before, but it's one of those things that can be so frustrating. So be sure to check that out. And then Sharon said, loved this challenge, had so much fun, looking forward to the next challenge. And the running joke here at Quilting is My Therapy is it's always like, Jeremy's like, oh, when are you going to do the next one? And I'm like, I just finished. But we already have one kind of tentatively scheduled. Look for something to be announced April or May. And I'm tentatively thinking about doing a help, how do I quilt it too? So different blocks than I used in the first video series, because it is hard to pick, or sometimes it's hard to know what designs to use where. So looking forward to that. I will be doing live chats up until then. We'll just do on an assortment of topics. And if you're watching this and you're like, oh, I'm just now checking out the video series from, last year, you can still ask questions specific to that. It's totally fine. So hopefully that helps. All right, let's see what questions we got. All right, which Handy Quilter machine do I use to free motion? So on my long arm, I have a Handy Quilter Avante. Sorry. It's an 18-inch throat space. It's the one I've had, almost 10 years now. Love that thing. And then I actually have a Handy Quilter Amara here in the filming studio. And then for the sewing machine, it's an HQ 610. So it's a Handy Quilter sewing machine. If I don't win the clips, where can I get them? You can get them from our website. And I'll put a link in the description box, but quiltingismytherapy.com, or in the video, this live chat, you can click the See More button, and then there's a link there. So very helpful. Or if you have anything that you can use just to kind of help hold it to keep it from hanging over. Do I have an expanded workbook for the whole dot to dot series? I wanted so badly to do that. And that is my goal, to get my stuff together, to be so far ahead that I can have that done ahead of time so that you can purchase it just once and have that ebook. So hopefully the next challenge. I don't ever go back and compile them, because then somebody purchased some and didn't purchase the others. So not this one, hopefully the next one. What do I do when you have a seam that I can't get flat and you come across it when quilting? Oh, that's the best, isn't it? You're like ramming it, I'm like running into it like a car trying to jump a speed bump. Okay, you have a couple options with those bulky seams. You can avoid it, but if you do too much of that, you're going to get little nipples on your quilt. Sorry, that's just what I think of when I see those. You could use something to flatten it out, and so I'm being for real here, a hammer, or hit it with something to smush it down. Another thing that can help is if you have a free motion foot that's a dynamic foot, like it kind of bounces, it's usually like an oval foot, that will kind of help it bounce over those bulky seams. So if I were doing like a t-shirt quilt with a ton of bulky seams, I would just go ahead and put that foot on. Now, if I'm working with a long arm, that has a hopping mechanism already, so that's going to be totally fine. But if it is so bulky that I can't get over it, on some long arms you can raise the foot, but it's not easy and it's not ideal. I will say I've been long arming for a long time. I've never raised my foot, so hope that helps. When you have an area with two fabric colors, red, purple, how do I decide which color thread to use? I have a whole list of things I think through. What's the ratio? Is there more of one color than the other? Is one a solid and one a print? Because I know that the thread color is going to show up more on the solid. If I have to pick one, I'm not going to switch thread colors. I try to split the difference. So if I have purple and red, I might do pink, something like that. And then I like lighter thread on darker fabrics. So personal preference, but if I'm ever in doubt between two thread colors, I almost always tend to go to the lighter color. The thread color you use is such a personal preference. There's no right or wrong answer. And I know sometimes it's like, just tell me what to do, but hopefully that'll help you out. In the larger panel, are we filling in the white areas in the star? It's up to you. So the larger panel, the pieces are kind of spread out a little bit. I think it's about a ½ inch or so. I want to say I did some echoing maybe inside of it, but you can leave it unquilted as well. It's just going to give you a little bit of separation, a little pop there, and make it look nice. But it's up to you. When using the long arm, how do I base the panel when I'm working from the center out? Okay, I say this with love. I don't work from the center out on the panel, on the long arm. It's too difficult for me. When working on a long arm, for those of you that don't have one, you start at the top and you work in lines and you work your way down. And as you go, it rolls up around the roller, and then you can advance it that way. If I were to just go to the center, I'm going to have this unquilted quilt wrapped around, and when I come back to it, it's going to stretch and it might give me puckers. So if you wanted to start in the center, I would load my long arm, put basting stitches throughout until you get to the center, quilt it, and then you can work your way back up there. So the short answer is you need to stabilize it. I know some long armers that take their quilt sandwich, take it to their sewing machine, stitch in all the ditches, and then load the whole sample that way too. So there's a couple ways you can go about it. I almost always, very, very rarely will start in the center, which I know if you've watched some of my video series, some of this, they start in the center, and I'm always like, I'm sorry, long armers. I'm sorry, but sometimes it just has to work that way. So hopefully that helps. I love these questions. These are such good ones. These are the kind of stuff that's hard to Google too. Like you're like, oh, I just wish I knew how to do this. Which stitch length do I typically use? So I don't use a stitch regulator on my long arm or my sewing machine. So I have more of an organic stitch length, meaning it varies depending on how fast I'm quilting. For newer quilters, if I have somebody that's like, oh, please just give me a number, I say, 10 to 12 stitches per inch. I almost said 16 to 18. I was thinking needle there for a second. 10 to 12 stitches per inch. Basically, you don't want your toe to get caught in it when you pull it over you, the quilt over you, but you don't want to stitch them so small because if you have to rip that out, it's no fun. So hopefully that helps. I'm having a really hard time doing swirls. Even practicing doesn't seem to help. How can I get better? Okay. Swirls are a frustrating design because it's not like, ooh, it clicks and it's just perfect. Ribbon candy is kind of like that. Wishbone's kind of like that, but swirls is a different thing. Every time you go, it refines. So here's a couple things. I don't know exactly what part of it you're struggling with. Don't stop. If you find that you're more of a perfectionist or you like to pause and critique what you're doing while you're doing it, that's not going to help you. With swirls, it's all about the momentum. It's about keeping going, keeping moving. You're like, I'm sure this looks bad, but I'm going to keep going because once you fill in that whole area, it's going to look better. Plus, that momentum is what helps you get that smooth line down. So if you're stopping a lot, it's hard to get going. And that's even for me, and I've been quilting for over 21 years. I'll be quilting swirls, and my kids will come in. I'm like, hold on a second, let me finish this. Let me get to a good stopping point. So hopefully that will help. Another thing, if you're on a long arm, I don't know the situation here, and you're like, I just can't. I've tried everything. If you're using a stitch regulator, sometimes it can make it harder to get those nice, smooth swirls. So maybe try manual, and you have to kind of play with it, find that speed. On a sewing machine, usually if we're getting those squared swirls, usually that's kind of the trouble there, look ahead of the needle. So you don't want to look right at the needle because you can't see where you're heading. You want to look ahead like driving a car. Now, I know that's scary, but that will help you get that nice, smooth line. And I will say, even though you feel like every time you practice, it doesn't seem to work, I guarantee you, if you got a yard of fabric, made a quilt sandwich, and quilted swirls over that whole thing, you will see improvement. Maybe not as much as you want, but you will definitely see improvement. And one last point, I could talk about swirls all day. When you're looking at other people's swirls, just know that's their handwriting style. So don't feel like you have to force your swirls to look like mine. As long as it's consistently filled in, the lines are smooth, and you like how it looks, it's going to be fine. So hopefully that helps. I know it can be frustrating. When doing the outline for the dark lines that surround each section on the panel, should we use a dark matching thread color or match the color on the design area? I'm going to use a thread color that matches the design area. I'm going to kind of cheat it to one side. And there were some examples. In fact, you can see in the video that sometimes the quilting goes over that black line. If that drives you crazy, get a black fabric marker and just color in those stitches and it will disappear. So that's what I would suggest. Of course, you can do whatever you want. I'm getting eyelashes on the back of the quilt when I do curves, but straight lines are fine. What am I doing wrong? All right, if you're on a sewing machine, what can happen is if you're moving not the same smoothness as you are with straight, you're going to get some pulling on it. So when somebody says it's only doing it in certain points, usually it's just learning how to move smoothly and confidently through that swirl. So with practice, what could happen is if you're moving, too fast or too slow, that needle is up and you're kind of pulling on that thread and kind of gives you those eyelashes. Beyond that, if you're like, no, I'm moving fine, it's great. You can check and see if your foot is a little too high. If your foot's too high, it's not holding those layers together as it's making the stitch, and it can kind of pull it a little bit. Hope that helps. I know it's so frustrating because I wish I could tell you, drink some red wine and it will go away. That would be great to be able to give you that. All right, and the winner of the quilt clips is Diane Kelsey. So Diane, go ahead and email us at customerservice@quiltingismytherapy.com, and we'll send you these, and hopefully they'll help you with it. And if you don't have a sewing machine, you quilt on long arm, you can fling them around like a Frisbee. So anyway, even though this kind of wraps up the dot to dot video series, I'll still be back with live chats talking about other machine quilting things, answering your questions. Again, I won't be here next week, but I will be here the week after, and we'll talk about thread tension and quilting problems. So get your questions ready for that. I hope you all have a great week, and I will see you in 2 weeks. Until then, everybody.